Might I have a word with you? Okay, I'm being silly, but the reality is that I want to cover one word with each of the sections today, and we are going to try to. Man, I do this all the time. Let me try that again. Welcome to Nycos. My sign says that. Why do I say that? Hello, and can I ask you a question? This is I'm just twisting in the wind here. Good morning. Actually, this is kind of a kind of a touchy subject, but how do you start your game? Is it nice and smooth? Do you sit down, sit at the table, and immediately begin to pontificate? Or maybe it's a little bit more chaotic. Maybe your players come straggling in one at a time and there's small talk and kibitzing, and perhaps you try to go over the details of last week's adventure, but you're not really able to catch the same nuance you had, and there's a level of frustration going into your game. NycosRPG is a site that's specifically to help you make your games better. And today we're going to talk about the cold open. I know it seems like it should be just old hat. I've been doing it for 50 years. It should be easy and it should come across smoothly. But as just evidenced by the S show that this last 3 minutes have been, is evidence that sometimes it doesn't go as smoothly as you would like or as fluidly as might be desired. But we're going to be talking in each category. Today we're going to talk about the chaos that results from role play and how to manage the chaos, because you have to eventually get started, right? Each session has to begin somewhere. And so, how do you get past the clutter and the noise and get to the meat of the episode? So, with that, don't are if you have not yet done so, follow this channel on Twitch, because that way you'll be able to know whenever we do a new release. You'll want to subscribe to this channel if you're on Twitch, because that way you get it commercial free. And you'll also want to provide feedback to the site. See, I'm doing it again. This is one of the coldest openings and roughest moanings I've had in a while. So stay with us for the rest of the show. Maybe I'll warm up. All right, let's get started. Well, no header worked better for this subject than the opening salvo. When I sit down to play a role play game, and I do it several times a week, each session is its own unique thing, and each group of players that you work with is different from every other, even if the majority of the players are the same. So I have several players now that are attending multiple sessions, partially because the story of Nikos is so rich and compelling that they're looking for additional connections into the story to gain more information, and partially because they enjoy the company that our games groups represent. And when you're talking about the opening of a game session, you have to really consider what do you call the opening. Is it when the first person shows up, or is it when the last person sits down and you get started? I believe that the opening starts at the very beginning, and the tone that you set in that first episode portion of the episode affects everything. So I anticipate that with my wonderfully rough opening into this episode, which I'm going to leave as it is because it kind of proves my point, the difficulties of a beginning really determine the uh, essence of the entire episode. It doesn't mean that you can't recover. It doesn't mean that you can't, settle down and get back to story. But even in those cases where you are able to, in essence, recover, that initial shakiness does impact the outside. I guarantee that with the rough start I had in this episode, well, and of course, you guys might prove me wrong. It might be that this becomes one of my greatest videos ever. Who knows? But and I'd love it if you could prove me wrong. But the rough opening, the slow, hesitant opening, is the greatest problem. And my opening salvo here in this case is I'm challenging you, if you are a game master, to give me your horror stories. What was the worst beginning you ever had of an episode? I'd love to hear from you and comment and discuss it. Let's have a great conversation in the comments. But when you are beginning the game, the first thing that you have to really do is you have to be organized. And obviously, I've been so busy in setting up the new way of the connection between the visuals and trying to make it look pretty on the outside, making sure that my lighting and my sound all are appropriately operating. Those all are elements that really should be done well in advance, so that when you get to the beginning, there's not the hesitancy, not the lack of a congruency, but instead you can immediately dive in. So let me apologize right off the get-go for having such a rough and choppy start to this episode, but I hope perhaps it will serve its purpose, and it'll prove to me in the long term whether this video is useful to anybody at all. Wow, that's a hard thing to say. All right, so we will go ahead and move into the rest of the show. There is a lot of news in the news section. I anticipated doing this in the evening tonight and trying to hold on to it, but the reality is that there's so much going on, I probably need to use both episodes to go into the details of it. So we will get started now with... Hey, Falatovia. Nice. Nice. Falatovia. Nice to meet you. All right. Hey, what up, old man? We're going to be talking about the news of Nikos. This is some earth-shattering pieces, quite literally. Well, not earth-shattering, I guess Nikos-shattering. But I'm going to be speaking really shortly on each of these pieces. These are the episodes. These are the campaigns that I'm currently running. All of them are contemporaneous. All of them are interacting with one another. So this is a rather exciting time. First of all, we're going to start off with the Heralds of the Change. And their current locale, is in the city of Nyx, which is in the Wilderlands on the western continent of Grolin. And their activities there have now unified collectively the persons that are the enjoined of the area, which is the player characters, as well as they've got a conclave of about a half dozen countries on the Grolin continent and a couple from Nordland that have, in effect, created a contract or an agreement to face off directly against the Middle Kingdom's empire, which is just formed. And so the clouds of war are starting to show on the horizon, as this represents the first time actively in this iteration that nations have declared fundamentally war on others. The unification of the Eldrin population by the Luthanen, an Eldrin who has played in the Nikos campaign since the 6th iteration, now is establishing a beachhead, if you will, in dealing with the rising threat that the Imperator of the Middle Kingdoms has presented. So it's going to be a challenging situation. It does also appear that the question of whether or not things in the East are well, apparently has been shattered by the news that Queen Catelyn Delanoir, the Faeline, which is a sec-gen, she's a feline person, a cat person, has been assassinated in the East, and that would maybe stricken here on YouTube. I don't know, but the news comes from Anchorage that she was holding her spring holiday ball, and at that function, in front of many witnesses, she was cut down in her prime, as it were, by a shadowy form who literally materialized out of a mist directly adjacent to her, and did the deed in front of many witnesses. And so it is apparent, it has been announced, therefore, that Catelyn Delanoir, the second governing official and the second noble in just over a month, has been taken out. So this will be an interesting time, as the nobles will probably try to retrench, and that will be across the entire continent. So that will be exciting. The group Strangers in the Strange Land have also revealed several things, one of which is they have finally left the city of Potiphar and have evidence of three major things. First of all, they have the evidence that the city of Potiphar was indeed attempting to imprison and perhaps traffic 4 Primus Eldrin that had come to them as refugees from the firefall, the burning of the mountains of the Silverblades. And the pressure was placed on them by the enjoined, which caused them to release their prisoners. And so 32 of the 48 were released from the city of Primus, the city of Potiphar, and are currently being transited to the city of Haven. Well, was a town. It's getting bigger all the time, but the town of Haven on the edge of Elwendale, in order to provide solace and coverage by the Freylaren Eldrin, who will more than likely take them in and give them protection during this terrible time. The second thing they've found was the particular ruins of what must have been the last location where Miri, the self-proclaimed goddess of Nykos, left her belongings. And so there is an archaeological team down there digging around in the dirt and trying to determine what she actually left as a legacy. And most importantly, it did provide the edicts and origination for the followers of Miri, so they now have a more codified religion. So it's going to be interesting what comes from that. And thirdly, in amongst that, they did find a copy of a recording of the first broadcast. Apparently, the great broadcaster who, in the beginning of the 8th iteration, provided guidance to the people of Nykos through a wish, basically, reached out and provided it's about a 5-minute presentation, and the video for that, the audio for that is available on yesterday's video. So check that out and watch that video to hear the actual words of the broadcaster. The being's name was Ralgrim, and his title, self-proclaimed, was the first crewmate of the Rainbow Church, and so of the Rainbow Church, and so therefore it's a very interesting video. So you should check that out as well. Next, we have the news of the Skiffborn, and the Skiffborn have had a bit of a rough go of it. Their airship was damaged in the mountains above Bastion and have been forced to retrace their steps back to the city to have the vessel repaired. And in that time, they also have noted for the first time a somewhat of an attempt to leverage Bastion by the Imperator's forces. And although they were repulsed and turned back and without martial conflict occurring, it does appear that the Empire of Man, presenting itself as the army of peace, may not be as peaceful as it might have been. There were rumors of people in Bastion seeing the forces of the Imperator marching westward towards Olmera. So there may be conflict physically within the next week or so as far as that. And by and large, the greatest piece of information, and it's kind of sad, is that the voyage of the Arcanai has fundamentally come to a close with a good piece of good news. Currently in the city of Bylon, the last survivor of the voyage of the Arcanai has finally returned to the mainland, validating that there is indeed a second continent, that there is another continental mass some distance to the south, some 2 weeks or more south. They sailed before they actually made landfall. And so the return of this single eyewitness has caused a great concern, and the Bylani people are doing what they can to protect this enjoined until such time as they can gather as much information from her as possible. They are actively speaking against the desire for adventure that the southern continent represents, merely on the basis that they want to be able to counteract their native or their nearby neighbor, who the Mir have actually in Canaveral now apparently made several successful tests of a ballistic system, whether that be rockets or missiles or whatever. That's very, very much left in the open at this point, but their devices have been tested, and so that will be make for very interesting times coming up. Now, all of this will be covered more deeply in tonight's report, but I just wanted to give you that, and we will have a repeat of the broadcaster message so that a wider audience can hear the words of history being repeated. Welcome to Game Master's Guide. We have a lot still to cover in today's show. I did want to take this time to thank you for being here, and if you haven't yet, check out our Patreon at patreon.nycos, patreon.com/Nycos, as this will be a great way for you to become a part of our community. We have game sessions on Saturdays and Sundays that are Patreon supporters only events. So if you want to be part of this world and become a part of our community, check those out at patreon.com/Nycos. Alrighty, we're talking about openings and beginnings, and one of the greatest things that a game master can do is be prepared, and the toolbox is the place where we talk about the very mechanisms of how we play role-play games. And one of the things that I recommend for game masters is a storybook, a a physical document where you keep track of the stories that are going on in your games. I usually have my notebook set up right adjacent to me while I'm running so that I can scribble out the notes, because it's so easy to overlook the things that happen in a game session because you get into, for example, uh, a pun war, or you get involved with the nuance of describing a location that you forget to write down the NPCs' names. And there are so many places that our familiarity as storyteller to our players becomes so um, embroiled that we forget to carry forward the little details, like NPC names. I can't tell you how many times that a persona starts the story with one name, and by the end of the second episode or third episode, their name is completely changed, and we don't even remember what the original one was until somebody happens to stumble upon it in their notes. So having an established notebook that you keep with you for each game session or each game story is really helpful. And in my case, I have so many of them that I have to actually keep them in one major book rather than try to break it out. Therefore, I'm utilizing a spiral so that I can add extra pages as we go along, because there just simply is too much information that comes up. The second thing about being prepared, the second thing about your openings, is to have your materials out and ready. If you're running late to a session, you're not going to have this opportunity. But generally, you want to have your dice and your pencils and your recording materials, and if you're using them, your miniatures and terrain, all prepared and ready to rock and roll at the beginning, because the difficulty in getting started is already difficult enough aligning the players into, it's like getting them into a boat and getting them all rowing in the same direction. If you haven't given them the guidance of knowing when to start and having your stuff together, it's really hard to get the players to develop that habit if you yourself are not. So I know when I fumbled my introduction in this episode today that I'm going to be perhaps interfering with the ability of each of these sections to work, but this toolbox element of the what I call my writer's, I actually call my notebook, because it's getting rather bulky, my writer's block, because the reason writer's block occurs, generally speaking, and perhaps I'm only speaking for myself, but I believe this is the case in general, is that you simply have overtaxed your creative mechanism, and therefore you leave yourself without enough fuel to spontaneously create new. And that's one of the reasons why I run as many games as I do, because the energy that it takes to get started is itself momentous, but once you're up and started, you want to keep that rolling. And so by having multiple games in the same world at the same time, I can be engineering and moderating the whole of the flow of the game so that it maintains that coherence and continuity, games group over games group. Now, it's important to note that when I speak of campaigns running, the story among all of them is the same, but the elements that the player group is pursuing is different, so that I don't want anyone to think that, for example, the encounters that Heralds of the Change interact with are the same specifics as, for example, the Skiffborn. They might be in completely different parts of the world and therefore be interacting with different types of enemies and different kinds of adventures. So it's not that I'm literally running, for example, Tomb of Horrors for everybody and they're just at different stages in the same adventure. No, these are disparate groups moving across a planetary scale and engaging with the enemies that they find in the locations where they are. And while they are contiguous, in other words, when I speak of the Empire of Man under the Imperator Darkenval, that villain is the same throughout all of them, but whether or not he's in a place where he can be interacted with matters. So Group A might be in Eldrissar in the middle of the continent, while another one might be in Nyx, etc. And so they're literally a continent away from one another, and yet the interaction with the villains is dependent upon where the villain is. So I have to mention that because it sometimes can be confused. People who have gotten used to calling an adventure thread their campaign don't realize that there might be a world beyond that the players might be interacting with if only they were with a different group. So, having said that, the initiation of your game session really comes down to your preparedness, because the more prepared you are, the more efficient you become. And while today's episode is not a good example of that, nonetheless, I do believe it will prove my point over time. And those of you that find this hidden gem clear back here in the Game Master's Toolbox will have done your game session a great service. Oops. Well, that was exciting. Alrighty. So finally, I'm going to get down to my rant, and this is more a rant against myself than anybody else right now. One of the biggest bugaboos is having a game that doesn't get a good start, and it's if you have a games group that gets together on a weekly basis, and the week's game, you wait for it all week long until that Friday night game, for example, and then the Friday night game comes and your players aren't prepared, they don't show up on time, they have drama in their own lives they want to discuss. And don't get me wrong, those are great things, but they are counterproductive to the story development. And so, from a game standpoint, it's a nightmare to have a game start off poorly, especially if you have a limited game session. I, for a while, had a Friday game that was literally played between 7 and 9, so you only had a 2-hour window to try to get adventuring done. And in the time, I was running Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and while that system does have some caveats that make it run smoothly, there were a lot of problems in the games that we held simply because they took a lot of time to resolve the conflicts within them. And when you have a bad game and it takes a half an hour to get started, but your entire game session is only 2 hours, that is a problem. And so we got to the point where I would show up an hour early to make sure that I was prepared. I would have everything ready, and literally as the last person showed up, we were started. We didn't have any kibitz time. Now, we learned our lesson, because after 3 months of this, we ended up defaulting to having some form of debrief after the game, which then led the game time period to be almost 4 hours, but 2 of them were merely kibitzing time about the games that we'd already run. And while that's not a bad thing, I enjoy that. It's really, from the standpoint of story development, still problematic because you're only getting 2 hours of action each week. And so when we are talking about the beginnings of your session, they are critical because the tone is created and established. The story so far is established and continues, but only if you've made a smooth transition of it. And so today's episode of Game Master's Guide clearly shows that this is the case. And I will remind you also at this point that we do have sessions online here Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 11 o'clock p.m. Pacific. And in particular, Tuesday nights is Nycos Nightly News. And so tonight's show will be dedicated to the stories that I outlined just a bit ago. And we'll be filling in considerably more detail about how what appears to be the first Nycosian World War is forming up. And so much more to come. Thank you for being here, and we will see you all in the next episode.